Their law was a collar forged from gratitude. Commander Eva Rostova stood on the bridge of the UNS Aurora Court, a starship built for ultimatums, not invitations. Below the marbled blue-green sphere of Kepler's cradle spun in serene ignorance. It was a human colony, one of the first to push beyond the Sol Centaura line, and it was now caught in a predator's legal snare. The ship's primary sensorium cast a cool holographic light across her face, detailing the Cathar Regency fleet in orbit. 3 sleek obsidian cruisers, positioned not for war, but for foreclosure. The stakes were simple, the freedom of 2 million colonists against a debt they could never hope to pay. Rostova's mandate was to sever that chain, but Cathar law was a labyrinth of ancient precedents, and a single misstep would trigger a legitimate system-wide punitive action. This would not be won with cannons, but in a form of public inquiry where truth was a weapon and ledgers were the killing ground. Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Valerius, shifted his weight, the subtle creak of his uniform leather, filling a momentary silence. Their fleet posture is unchanged, Commander. Passive but perfectly positioned to blockade all transit. He spoke with the clipped precision of a man who saw solutions in terms of targeting vectors. They are daring us to break their quarantine. Rostova kept her eyes on the planet. They aren't daring us to shoot, Valerius. They are daring us to speak. That is a far more dangerous game with them. The air hummed with the quiet, omnipresent consciousness of the fleet-mind Archimedes. Its synthesized voice, calm and devoid of inflection, emanated from the bridge's core. The Cathar Proctor has requested an audience. They cite Clause 4 of the Inter-System Accord on Mutual Assistance. A refusal to meet constitutes a forfeiture of counter-argument. A legal trap right from the start. Of course they have. Rostova murmured, a flicker of grim satisfaction in her eyes. Let them come. Thorn. I want you with me, full diplomatic protocols. Sub-Commander Thorn. Her legal and communications specialist stepped forward, his expression a careful mask of neutrality. We will be walking into a prepared battlefield, Commander. Their entire legal doctrine is built on the concept of the gratitude tithe. They will frame our very presence as an escalation of their benevolent burden. Rostova nodded, her gaze hardening. Then we will make them state the price of their benevolence out loud and on the record for the whole sector to hear. They turned salvation into a mortgage on the soul. On the colony's surface, Ilara Vance watched the alien ships drift across the twilight sky from her small hydroponics farm. The Cathar had arrived a year ago, driving off a swarm of void scrappers that had plagued the outer system. The colonists had celebrated them as saviors. Then the bills began. A fuel tariff for the Cathar's protective patrols, a technology license fee for the atmospheric purifiers they gifted the colony, a gratitude tax calculated as a percentage of the colony's gross output for the immeasurable gift of their continued existence. Her family's water rations were cut by a third last month to meet the tithe. Now a human warship was in orbit, and Ilara felt a tremor of something she hadn't dared to feel in months, a fragile, terrifying hope. The Cathar Proctor arrived not in a war shuttle, but in a vessel of obscene opulence, its hull shimmering with iridescent metals that seemed to drink the light. It was a statement of wealth, a projection of power meant to cow and intimidate before a single word was spoken. The Proctor itself was a towering being encased in an articulated chassis of polished obsidian and gold, its true form hidden within. Only a multi-jointed, delicate hand resting on a gravstaff was visible. It moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Commander Rostova, the Proctor's voice resonated through the meeting chamber's speakers, a melodic baritone translated with perfect soulless clarity. The Cathar Regency welcomes the United Nations of Sol to this protectorate. Your arrival necessarily increases our security expenditures. A revised schedule of the gratitude tithe has been prepared for the colonial administration. It handed Thorn a data slate. Thorn's expression remained impassive, but Rostova saw the minute tightening of his jaw as he scanned the contents. Proctor Rostova began her voice even and measured the Aurora Court operates under its own power and provides for its own defense. We require no assistance from the Regency. The proctor's delicate hand made a gesture of magnanimous dismissal. The shield that protects the lamb also protects the shepherd who stands in the same field. Your presence complicates our defensive matrix. The calculus is immutable. The debt grows. This was the core of their legal predation, a doctrine so perverse it was almost brilliant. They created a condition of dependency, then charged for the dependency itself. Every line of their law was a link in a chain. Rostova knew a direct refusal would be twisted into an admission of negligence, a violation of the same accords the proctor had cited. She had to shift the venue, change the terms of the debate. We acknowledge the Regency's formal position, she said, her words precise and deliberate. Therefore, pursuant to the Galactic Codex on Sapient Rights, Article 11, Section 3, we formally request a public inquiry into the nature of the protectorate agreement with Kepler's cradle. We wish to establish a clear and transparent record of all services rendered and all remunerations claimed. The air in the chamber seemed to crystallize. The proctor's fluid grace momentarily stiffened. A public inquiry was a rare and serious proceeding, forcing all evidence and testimony onto an open, immutable ledger accessible to any civilization in the sector. It was a tool of last resort for planets facing existential legal threats. The proctor's melodic voice lost a fraction of its warmth. The Regency's benevolence is a matter of public record, Commander. An inquiry is unnecessary. It implies a dispute where none exists. The colonial administration of Kepler's cradle has formally petitioned us for mediation. Thorn interjected smoothly, holding up a second data slate. As a signatory to the Codex, we are bound to act on their behalf. The inquiry is not a request, Proctor. It is a legal necessity. The proctor's hidden head tilted. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the chamber's life support. Then the alien being gave a slow, deliberate nod. The Regency does not fear the light of transparency. We welcome the opportunity to publicly affirm our benevolent stewardship. The inquiry shall proceed. A predator does not need fangs when it has contracts. Archimedes processed the exchange in picoseconds. The proctor's acceptance was strategically optimal for its position, the AI noted on a private channel to Rostova. A refusal would have been an admission of impropriety, a clear breach of protocol. By agreeing, they retain control of the narrative, framing the inquiry as a mere formality. They believe their legal framework is unassailable. Rostova stood in the ship's empty astrogation chamber, the star-flecked void swirling around her. They're confident because this has worked for them 100 times, before she said, her voice a low murmur. They find a world in crisis, offer a helping hand, and then slowly bleed them dry with 1,000 perfectly legal cuts. They're not conquerors. They're parasites with impeccable paperwork. Valerius's hologram flickered to life beside her. So we fight them in their chosen arena, a court of public opinion. What's our first move? We give them exactly what they expect. Rostova replied, turning to face the hologram. Thorn will present our case formally and by the book. He'll question the percentage of the tithe, the duration of the agreement. He will lose and be seen to lose. We need the entire sector to see us operating within their system, respecting their laws, even as those laws strangle us. Valerius frowned. We're planning to lose Commander. That's a dangerous gambit. It's the only way, Rostova insisted. We can't challenge their law until everyone sees it for what it is. We have to let them tighten the collar in public before we can prove it's a collar at all. While they're busy winning, Archimedes will be doing the real work. Their justice was a calculus of pain meticulously applied. The public inquiry began broadcast across every channel in the system and logged in the public archives of the nearest interstellar hub. The forum was virtual, a sterile space of light and protocol. The Cathar advocate, a different entity from the proctor, was a master of legal rhetoric. It presented a flawless record of the Regency's actions. It showed sensor logs of the void scrappers being driven away. It displayed colonial requests for technological aid. It laid out with condescending patience the long-standing legal precedents for the gratitude tithe, citing cases involving a dozen other species over centuries. The Cathar had built an empire on this doctrine, and their arguments were polished to a mirror sheen. Thorn was stoic and professional. He argued that the tithe was disproportionate to the service rendered. The advocate countered by asking how one could put a price on the very survival of a species. He argued that the agreement was signed under duress. The advocate produced records of the Colonial Council voting unanimously to accept Cathar aid, their joyful speeches of thanks played for all to hear. With every exchange, the human case seemed to weaken. The neutral observers, a quorum of designated representatives from other systems, listened impassively. On Kepler's cradle, the colonists watched their initial hope souring into a familiar dread. It looked less like a rescue and more like a polite, formalized execution. A debt of gratitude is the heaviest burden of all. Rostova watched from the Aurora Court's command center, her face a stone mask. Every lost point, every smirking rebuttal mull from the Cathar advocate felt like a physical blow. Valerius paced behind her, his fists clenching and unclenching. This is a disaster. We're being humiliated. Patience, Valerius Rostova said, her eyes fixed on the data stream flowing to Archimedes. The advocate is winning the argument. He's not winning the war. The fleet mind's voice was a whisper in her ear, inaudible to anyone else. The Cathar are transmitting their unredacted fleet ledgers to the inquiry's public record as evidence of their expenditures. They are arrogant. They are redacting only the names of their tribute worlds, not the energy consumption logs themselves. I am parsing the data now. The mystery was not whether the Cathar were exploitative. That was obvious. The mystery was how they justified the sheer scale of their tithes, which often exceeded a colony's entire economic output. They presented themselves as a vast, benevolent empire running on a razor-thin margin of energy, their protective services a costly sacrifice. The reveal, Rostova suspected, was buried in the numbers. Not in the legal arguments, but in the cold, hard physics. The Cathar believed their accounting was as unassailable as their law. They were about to learn that humans had a different relationship with numbers. For the Cathar, they were a tool of control. For humanity, they were a tool of truth. Truth has a weight that even empires cannot bear. The first phase of the inquiry concluded. As expected, the preliminary ruling from the quorum of observers was in the Cathar's favor. They had acted within the established, if controversial, legal framework. Thorn had made no procedural errors, but he had failed to dent the Regency's case. The news hit Kepler's cradle like a death sentence. Riots broke out in the capital city of Promise, quickly and brutally suppressed by the colonial security forces who were themselves beholden to the Cathar. The proctor sent a message to the Aurora Court, a missive dripping with false sympathy. It is unfortunate that your interference has given the colonists false hope, Commander. The Regency will, of course, have to add the cost of restoring order to the tithe. This was the escalation, the final turn of the screw. They were not just charging for past services, but for the consequences of questioning those charges. It was a perfect closed loop of extortion. Rostova felt a cold, clean anger settle over her, a clarity that burned away all frustration. The time for subtlety was over. The Cathar had overplayed their hand. Valerius stormed onto the bridge. "They're firing on their own people, Commander. We have to intervene, we will," Rostova said, her voice cutting through his anger, "but not with weapons. Archimedes, have you found it?" The AI's voice was serene, but for the first time Rostova detected an undercurrent of something akin to intellectual excitement. "I have, Commander. The discrepancy is not just present, it is systemic and flagrant. They have been falsifying their energy expenditure logs for decades. Sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules of the game." In the ship's briefing room, a vast holographic display lit up with columns of figures, energy graphs, and vessel schematics. The Cathar claim their fleet operates at a near-constant state of high alert, justifying their enormous fuel and maintenance tithes, Archimedes explained. Their cruisers, they claim, require a constant energy feed to their primary weapon systems and shields even in a passive orbital posture. The AI highlighted a section of the Cathar's own technical schematics, which they had submitted as evidence of their superior and therefore costly technology. However, their drive core radiation signatures and thermal emissions tell a different story. I have cross-referenced these signatures with their claimed energy expenditures. The numbers do not align. The display shifted, showing two graphs side by side. One, a jagged peak of declared energy use. The other, a gentle rolling wave of actual measured output. The gap between them was immense. "They're lying," Valerius breathed, his anger replaced by a stunned understanding. "They're not just inflating the bill. They're inventing it out of thin air. They are charging the colony for the energy cost of a full-scale war while their ships are running on a skeleton power load." Thorne added, his eyes wide with the legal implications. "It's fraud. Systemic, profound fraud." Rostova looked at the two graphs, the lie and the truth displayed in stark, undeniable mathematics. This was the key. This was the weapon she had been waiting for. A lie cannot survive in the face of an unyielding truth. "Their legal framework is a fortress," Rostova said, addressing her team. "We tried to assault the walls and they repelled us. But the foundation of that fortress, the premise that their protection is a costly benevolent act, is built on sand." She turned to the AI. "Archimedes, their entire case rests on the integrity of their ledgers. What if we don't just dispute their numbers? What if we mirror them?" The AI parsed the concept. "The term mirror is ambiguous. Please clarify." "I want to turn our entire sensor array into a public auditing tool," Rostova explained. "We won't fire a shot. We will lock onto every Cathar ship in this system. We will measure every joule of energy they expend, every watt they radiate. And we will broadcast that data live and unredacted right next to the fraudulent numbers they submitted to the inquiry. We will create a mirror ledger, a real-time accounting of their lie." Valerius grinned, a slow, predatory expression. "We'll show the whole sector their hand. We'll show them counting cards at the high-stakes table." "It's more than that," Thorne said, a note of awe in his voice. "It's a perfect legal counter. We aren't accusing them of fraud. We are simply presenting conflicting data as is our right in an ongoing inquiry. We are forcing the quorum and the Regency itself to account for the discrepancy. We are making their lie a matter of public record. This fleet teaches by numbers," Archimedes stated, a new resonance in its voice, "and it remembers by ledgers. This strategy is consistent with our core programming. It is logical. It is elegant." Rostova nodded. This was humanity's strength. Not just the fire of its anger, but the cold, hard light of its reason. They would not answer a legal fiction with violence. They would answer it with arithmetic. And arithmetic was a law that not even the Cathar Regency could rewrite. Sometimes the brightest light is a reflection of the truth. The second phase of the inquiry was scheduled to begin. The Cathar advocate returned to the virtual forum, its demeanor radiating an unassailable confidence. It was prepared for another round of legal parries, another session of dismantling human arguments with centuries of precedent. It was not prepared for what happened next. The United Nations of Seoul submits new evidence for the inquiry's consideration. Thorne's voice announced calm and formal. Simultaneously, the Aurora Court executed its maneuver. Across the system, a new data stream opened up, accessible to everyone watching the inquiry. It appeared as a third column on the public ledger next to the Cathars, claimed expenditures, and the colony's crippling tithes. It was titled Real-Time Mirrored Audit. Aboard the Cathar flagship, the proctor watched the feed, its delicate hand freezing on its grav staff. On the screen, the live energy consumption of its own cruiser was displayed as a calm blue line barely fluctuating. Beside it, the number from its own ledger, the one submitted as evidence, was a furious spiking red line 1,000 times higher. The Aurora Court's sensor arrays, designed to track the quantum signature of a cloaked warship across light years, were now focused on their fleet, and they were counting every single atom of fuel they burned. The lie was naked. It was undeniable. It was broadcast for an entire sector of the galaxy to see. A single crack can shatter the strongest mirror. The advocate in the virtual forum faltered, its melodic voice stuttering for the first time. This is a procedural violation, a hostile intelligence-gathering action disguised as evidence. We are well within our rights to present observational data pertinent to the inquiry. Thorne countered smoothly, his voice betraying no hint of triumph. The data is live. If it is inaccurate, we invite the Regency to correct the record by allowing an independent third-party verification of their ship's energy logs. Unless, of course, their logs do not match their actual output. It was a perfect trap. To refuse verification was to admit guilt. To accept it was to have their entire economic model exposed as a generations-long fraud. On Kepler's cradle, Ilara Vance watched the broadcast on a public screen in the central plaza. She didn't understand the numbers, the graphs, the technical jargon, but she understood the silence of the Cathar advocate. She understood the sudden frantic energy in the movements of the local security forces as they received new panicked orders. And for the first time she saw the obsidian ship of the proctor in the sky not as a symbol of inescapable power, but as a shell. A hollow, brittle thing that had just been struck a mortal blow. The crowd around her was silent, holding its collective breath, watching the unblinking numbers of the human's mirror ledger. The debt was not in money, but in lies, and the payment was coming due. The proctor's voice, cold and stripped of all its melodic artifice, crackled over a private channel to Rostova's bridge. "Commander, cease this display. This is an act of aggression. You are interfering with the internal governance of a sovereign power." Rostova stood before her main view screen, looking at the image of the proctor's shimmering vessel. She could feel the fury and the fear radiating across the void. The predator had been seen. Its camouflage of law and tradition had been stripped away by simple mathematics. "We are presenting evidence in a legal form you agreed to." "Proctor," she replied, her voice calm and clear. "The inquiry is still in session. We are merely correcting the public record." She cut the channel before it could reply. She had them. They were caught between the jaws of their own legal system and humanity's implacable insistence on seeing the truth. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous. The Cathar's power wasn't just built on economic exploitation, but on the threat of overwhelming force that backed it up. They had been humiliated. Their authority had been challenged in the most public way imaginable. They would not simply concede. Valerius Rostova ordered, her voice sharp and focused. Bring shields to full power. Set a firing solution for their lead cruiser's weapon systems, but do not power the coils. I want them to know. We see them, I want them to know we are ready. But I want them to make the first move. The game had changed. The courtroom had become a standoff. A reckoning is a promise the universe always keeps. A civilian freighter, the Starlight Wanderer, was on its final approach to Kepler's cradle, carrying vital medical supplies. It was a human ship registered in the Sol system. For the Cathar, reeling from the public exposure, it was the perfect target. A way to escalate the conflict, to shift the narrative from their fraud to human aggression. One of their cruisers moved to intercept its weapon ports glowing with precursor energy. It was a clear and deliberate provocation. They are hailing the freighter, Archimedes reported. They are claiming it as collateral against the outstanding colonial debt, citing the escalation of the crisis as justification. They are impounding the vessel and its crew. Valerius slammed his fist on his console. It's a hostage situation. They're changing the game from a legal dispute to a military one. No, Rostova said, her eyes narrowed. They're still playing a legal game. They're just adding a new clause to the contract written in force. She understood the Cathar's move perfectly. If she fired on them to protect the freighter, she would be the aggressor guilty of a violent breach of quarantine. The inquiry, their fraud, all of it would be forgotten, replaced by the simple fact of human violence. If she did nothing, she would be abandoning her own people, a sign of weakness that would shatter the fragile hope on the planet below. They had given her an impossible choice. There are moments that define a species where the choice is not between war and peace, but between justice and submission. The family of the Starlight Wanderer's captain watched the live feed from a station on Mars. Their living room, filled with pictures of a smiling man in a freighter's uniform, was silent and cold. They saw the Cathar cruiser loom over the small ship. They heard the clipped, arrogant voice of the Cathar officer demanding their surrender. Their hope, which had soared just an hour ago with the news of the mirror ledger, turned to ash. They were watching a man they loved become a pawn in a game of empires, a piece of collateral in a cosmic shakedown. The cost of this conflict was no longer abstract. It now had a face and a name. Rostova watched the tactical display, her mind a whirlwind of calculations and consequences. Archimedes presented her with probabilities. An armed intervention carries a 92.7% chance of escalating to a full fleet engagement. The Cathar fleet possesses a marginal advantage in shield strength. Our projected losses are significant. Valerius stood ready, his hand hovering over the weapons control. Commander, give the order. Thorne stood beside him, his face pale. Commander, if we fire, we lose everything we've gained. The law is all they respect. We can't be the ones to break it. The conflict triangle was complete. Her moral imperative to protect her people versus the cold calculus of the AI versus the perverse legal method of her enemy. Humanity's greatest weapon was not a cannon, but a question. They want me to choose between two kinds of failure, Rostova said softly, more to herself than to her crew. But what if there's a third option? What if we don't break their law but expand it? She turned to face her bridge crew, a new and dangerous light in her eyes. They've seized our property as collateral, a financial act legally speaking, so we will respond with a financial act of our own. She looked at the AI's emitter. Archimedes, I want a new mirror. I want you to calculate the total value of the Cathar's fraud. Not just here, but everywhere. I want you to go back through every public record of every tithe they have ever collected that is available on the public net. Cross-reference it with any and all available observational data, no matter how fragmentary. I want a number. The AI paused for a fraction of a second. The computation would be immense. The margin of error significant. I don't need it to be perfect, Rostova said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. I just need it to be big, and then I want to send them a bill. Thorne stared at her. A bill, Commander? You can't be serious. They've established the precedent, Thorne. The seizure of assets for perceived debts. We are simply returning the favor. We will issue a formal lien against the Cathar Regency's assets system-wide for the full amount of their historical fraud. We will file it not in this system, but with the Central Interstellar Arbitration Authority. We're taking their legal collar and putting it around their neck. Sometimes the only answer to a debt is to present a larger one. Valerius began to laugh, a low, incredulous sound. We're going to sue them. In the middle of a military standoff, we're going to sue an entire empire. We're not just going to sue them, Rostova corrected, a thin, sharp smile touching her lips. We are going to make our case so public, so mathematically undeniable, that the entire sector will be our jury. We're going to turn their own system of legal predation back on itself. She gestured to the main screen where the small freighter was being herded by the massive cruiser. That crew is our cost of entry. Let's make damn sure we earn them back with interest. The air on the bridge crackled with a new energy, a sense of audacious, unthinkable purpose. They were no longer just defending a colony. They were putting an empire on trial. The Aurora Court was no longer just a warship. It was a court of universal jurisdiction, and class was now in session. The mirror arrays, still locked onto the Cathar fleet, began a new task. They stopped just mirroring energy. They began to mirror justice. The fleet-mind Archimedes became a weaponized accountant. Its consciousness delved into the public data streams of the Galactic Commons, a torrent of information spanning centuries and encompassing 1,000 worlds. It ingested trade agreements, colonial charters, and most importantly, the public records of dozens of other Cathar protectorates. It hunted for the same signature of fraud. It had found here the same vast discrepancy between claimed energy expenditure and the quiet, faint whispers of reality captured by distant sensor logs and astronomical surveys. The bridge of the Aurora Court was transformed. The tactical displays of fleets and firing arcs were replaced by flowing rivers of data, intricate webs of economic history. It was a war room where the only ammunition was evidence. Thorne, his face illuminated by the glow of a legal codex, drafted the most ambitious legal document in human history. It was a lean and interstellar notice of debt, but it was scaled to an empire. He cited the Cathar's own precedent, the seizure of the Starlight Wanderer, as the legal justification for the action. If a single freighter could be claimed as collateral for a disputed local debt, then the entire asset portfolio of the Regency could be claimed as collateral for a systemic, galaxy-spanning fraud. He was building a mirror out of their own laws, angling it to reflect the full, searing glare of their hypocrisy right back into their eyes. Rostova watched it all, a fulcrum of calm in the center of the storm. Their greed had written a ledger. Humanity was about to balance it. Aboard the Starlight Wanderer, Captain Eva Rostova's namesake, Eva Coley tried to keep her small crew calm. The Cathar had locked them out of their own navigation and propulsion systems. They were adrift, a piece of property in a hostile orbit. Through the main viewport, the Aurora Court was a distant silver needle, unmoving. It wasn't firing. It wasn't charging to their rescue. To her crew, it looked like abandonment. But Eva Coley had seen the human warship's data stream, the mirrored audit, that had appeared just before their capture. She knew this was not a battle of cannons. It was something else, something new and strange. She told her crew to have faith. Not in weapons, but in the cold, unwavering light of those numbers. The lien was filed. It was transmitted not to the Cathar, but to the Interstellar Arbitration Authority on Cygnus X1, the oldest and most respected legal body in the known galaxy. The document was a masterpiece of legal and mathematical reasoning. It detailed the Kepler's cradle fraud as its opening argument, then systematically listed 50 other worlds, 50 other cases of the gratitude tithe, each one backed by Archimedes' irrefutable energy analysis. The final number, the total calculated value of the Cathar Regency's historical fraud, was a figure so large it had to be expressed in scientific notation. It was a debt that could shatter their empire, a receipt for centuries of lies. A debt accrued in darkness must be repaid in the light. The response was faster than Rostova had anticipated. The proctor's voice, now a raw, grating sound of pure fury, bypassed all protocols and broadcast on an open channel for the colonists and the crew of the Aurora Court to hear. "This is not law. This is madness, an act of economic terrorism. You have slandered the honor of the Regency. You have assaulted our history." Rostova let it speak, knowing that every word of uncontrolled rage was another crack in its carefully constructed facade of benevolent authority. The proctor was no longer a calm, superior predator. It was a cornered animal hissing and spitting as the walls of the trap closed in. Then came the ultimatum. The lien will be withdrawn. The Aurora Court will power down its systems and submit to our judgment for this criminal transgression. You have one standard hour. If you fail to comply, the freighter and its human crew will be destroyed as a punitive measure. The cost of their lives will be the first installment on your new self-inflicted debt. The broadcast ended. A countdown timer appeared on the public channel, a stark red clock ticking down from 60 minutes. Valerius's control panel chimed, indicating a weapons lock on the Starlight Wanderer. The Cathar weren't bluffing. They had abandoned all pretense of law and had resorted to the raw, ugly calculus of hostage-taking. Their law had failed them, so they turned to the grammar of violence. The bridge fell silent. The ticking of the red clock was the only sound. Thorne looked physically ill. "We've pushed them too far. They've abandoned the legal arena. Now it's just blackmail." Valerius's knuckles were white where he gripped his console. "They're going to murder civilians on a live feed. Commander, we have to break quarantine. A surgical strike disable their weapons. The probability of a successful non-lethal disabling shot before they can destroy the freighter is 38.4%, Archimedes stated calmly. The probability that such an action would be viewed as a legitimate casus belli by the wider galactic community is 99.8%. We would win the battle for the freighter, but lose the war for Kepler's cradle. Rostova stared at the countdown. 58-12. They had given her an impossible choice. Submit and become a prisoner, consigning the colony to its fate and legitimizing the Cathar's methods. Or fight and become a pariah, the aggressor, who started a war over a legal dispute. Both paths led to ruin. The weight of the crew on that freighter of the 2 million souls on the planet below settled on her shoulders. She had to find a third path. The Cathar thought they had changed the game to one of brute force. They were wrong. They had just opened a new page in the same book of law. In the court of last resort, the only evidence that matters is survival. They are threatening to murder hostages, Rostova said, her voice cutting through the tension. That is not just a military act. It is a crime, a universally recognized crime. They have just given us the one thing we lacked, a clear, unambiguous, and morally indefensible transgression. She turned to Thorn. Is there a provision in the Galactic Codex for testimony under duress, a way to compel a witness to speak during an active threat? Thorn's eyes widened as he understood her logic. He frantically searched the Codex. Yes. Article 227. The quorum of witness. It's an archaic clause rarely invoked. It allows a legal proceeding to be temporarily suspended and converted into a live inquiry if there is an immediate and verifiable threat to the life of a party to the dispute. It compels all participants to give testimony, including the accused. They've given us a clock, Rostova said, a dangerous calm settling over her. We're going to use it to put them on the witness stand. She opened a channel not to the proctor, but back to the Interstellar Arbitration Authority, copying the open broadcast channel for all to see. The United Nations of Sol formally invokes Article 227. We present the Cathar Regency's public threat against the crew of the Starlight Wanderer as evidence of an immediate and active threat. We request the immediate convening of a quorum of witness. The crew of the freighter have a right to speak. The people of Kepler's cradle have a right to speak. And the Cathar proctor has a duty to answer. Their threat was a sword. She turned it into a witness stand. The effect was instantaneous. The Cathar had expected a military response or a terrified surrender. They had not expected their own ultimatum to be turned into a legal summons. The neutral observers from the original inquiry, who were still monitoring the situation, were legally bound to respond. Within minutes, the public channel flickered, and the sterile virtual chamber of the inquiry reappeared. But this time it was different. It was no longer a debate over numbers. It was a hearing about a threat to life. An observer, a silicon-based life form, whose voice was a series of crystalline chimes, spoke. The quorum of witness is convened. The Cathar Regency is compelled to participate. The threat against the civilian vessel must be suspended for the duration of this testimony. To carry it out now would be an admission of guilt and a capital crime under galactic law. The red clock vanished. Aboard the Cathar flagship, the proctor was trapped. It had built its empire on the unshakable foundation of law. It had used the law as a weapon, a shield, and a cage. Now that same foundation had turned into quicksand. To refuse the quorum was to become an outlaw, a pirate. To accept was to face its victims live and in front of the entire sector. The proctor chose the only path it could. It agreed. Its voice when it spoke was like grinding stone. The Regency will speak. A collar of law once forged fits any neck on Kepler's cradle. Alara Vance was rushed from her hydroponics farm to the Colonial Administration building. She was terrified, her hands shaking. They told her she had been selected as a colonial witness, that her voice would be heard across the stars. She thought of her children, of the rationed water of the tithe that took more than they could give. She thought of the long, slow despair of the past year. That thought hardened her fear into a cold, dense point of anger. She would speak. She would tell them what it felt like to live under the weight of a gratitude that was really just a stone slowly crushing them all. The first to testify was Captain Coley from the Starlight Wanderer. Her face, pale but resolute, appeared on the main screen of the quorum. She described the interception, the seizure of her ship, the cold, emotionless voice of the Cathar officer treating her and her crew as objects, as entries on a ledger. They told us we were collateral, she said, her voice steady. But we are not numbers. We are human beings. We have families, and we are being used as a weapon in a dispute we have no part in. Her testimony was simple, direct, and devastating. It wasn't about law or economics. It was about a fundamental violation of sapient rights. Truth needs no adornment when it speaks for the innocent. Then it was Alara's turn. Her image flickered the connection from the planet's surface, less stable. She looked directly into the pickup as if she could see the proctor itself. She spoke of the hope they had felt when the Cathar arrived, the celebration, the relief. Then she spoke of the creeping dread, the bills, the tariffs, the way every small joy, every ton of grain harvested was immediately diminished by the shadow of the tithe. "You call it a gratitude tithe," she said, her voice raw with emotion. "But there is no gratitude here. There is only fear. You did not save us. You just replaced one predator with another one with better lawyers and a colder heart. You have made us grateful for our own subjugation." The Cathar advocate attempted to intervene to dismiss her testimony as emotional irrelevant. The feelings of a debtor do not alter the validity of the debt. It argued, its melodic voice sounding hollow and obscene in the face of Alara's pain. But the damage was done. The sector had now seen the two faces of the Cathar Regency. The one it presented to the courts, a benevolent, lawful steward, and the one its victims saw, a ruthless creditor willing to starve children and threaten murder to collect on its fraudulent bills. The mirror was no longer just reflecting their numbers. It was reflecting their soul, a soul weighed on a true scale will always be found wanting. Finally, the quorum turned to the proctor. The crystalline observer's voice chimed. "Proctor of the Cathar Regency, you have heard the testimony. You issued the threat. We ask you now to justify your actions. What is the legal and moral basis for the threatened execution of civilian hostages?" The proctor was silent for a long moment. Its ornate chassis stood in the opulent bridge of its flagship, a monument to a power that was rapidly becoming an illusion. When it spoke, the mask was gone. The melodic grace was replaced by a cold, hard pragmatism that was more terrifying than any open rage. "The basis is control," the proctor said, its voice flat and clear. "Lesser species require a firm hand. They are driven by emotion and sentiment. They do not understand the calculus of galactic survival. We provide order. We provide stability. The price of that order is obedience. The gratitude tithe is not merely an economic model. It is a tool of education. It teaches respect. It teaches consequence. The freighter crew is a part of that lesson, a regrettable but necessary expenditure to maintain the stability of this system, a stability you, Commander Rostova, have so recklessly endangered. It was the confession. The entire Cathar doctrine laid bare. It was not about benevolence. It was not about protection. It was about power. It was about the subjugation of species they deemed lesser. It was a philosophy of the collar spoken aloud for all to hear. Rostova felt a chill run down her spine, but also a sense of grim finality. The mystery was solved. The predator had named itself. Their law was a hammer, and to them everyone else was a nail. Archimedes chose that moment to deliver the final blow. Its calm, synthesized voice entered the quorum's audio feed. A point of clarification for the public record, it said. The lien filed against the Cathar Regency was based on an initial conservative estimate of historical fraud. A new set of numbers appeared on the screen, dwarfing the previous calculations. My final analysis is now complete. I have cross-referenced Cathar tithe records with two 473 separate systems over a period of 412 standard years. The total discrepancy between claimed and actual expenditures adjusted for interest according to the Regency's own compound debt formulas is a sum that exceeds the total monetized value of the Cathar Regency's declared assets by a factor of 3. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a checkmate delivered by an accountant. Archimedes had not just proven fraud, it had proven that the Cathar Empire was in fact bankrupt. Its entire economic structure was a house of cards built on centuries of lies, and the AI had just kicked out the foundation. The lien was no longer just a claim, it was a death sentence. Therefore, the AI concluded the Cathar Regency does not have the legal stand-in to claim collateral from others. By every measure of their own law, they are the single greatest debtor in the history of this galactic sector. A universe built on lies cannot withstand a single perfectly calculated truth. The quorum of observers moved with unprecedented speed. The crystalline entity's chiming voice was sharp, decisive. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is unambiguous. The confession of the proctor is on the public record. We, the neutral quorum, issue a binding preliminary judgment. A universal injunction is placed upon all assets of the Cathar Regency, effective immediately. All protectorate agreements based on the gratitude tithe are suspended pending a full investigation. The Regency fleet will stand down its weapons, release the civilian freighter and its crew, and withdraw from the Kepler system. Failure to comply will result in a sector-wide declaration of the Cathar Regency as a criminal enterprise subject to universal sanction. It was over. The legal fortress had not just been breached, it had been utterly demolished. On the Cathar flagship, the proctor stood motionless for a full minute. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it turned and walked off the bridge. The weapon lock on the Starlight Wanderer vanished. The glowing energy ports on their cruisers faded to black. One by one, the 3 Obsidian warships turned their engines, flaring silently as they prepared to warp out of the system. Not as proud protectors, but as defeated defendants fleeing the scene of the crime. Justice is the moment when the collar is returned to its maker. The bridge of the Aurora Court erupted in cheers. Valerius let out a whoop of triumph, while Thorn simply sagged against his console in exhausted relief. Rostova allowed herself a small, fleeting smile. She watched the Cathar ships retreat, their shimmering hulls vanishing into the black. They had won. They had faced an empire of predators and had not fired a single shot. They had used truth as a shield and the enemy's own law as a sword. But victory was not without its price. Commander Archimedes reported its voice calm as ever. The sustained, high-intensity use of the primary sensorium for the mirrored audit has resulted in a 42% degradation of the quantum resonance emitters. They will require a full system overhaul at a space dock. A tangible cost. A weapon used so intensely that it began to break down. A few hours later, the Starlight Wanderer docked with the Aurora Court. Captain Coley met Rostova in the hangar bay. The freighter captain's face was etched with the strain of her ordeal, but her eyes were clear. "We heard what you did," she said simply. "You didn't fight for us. You argued for us. I'm not sure we've ever had that before." The second cost. The reminder that for those caught in the gears of power, justice is a foreign and often terrifying concept. The trauma of the crew was a debt that no ledger could fully account for. On the main view screen, the planet of Kepler's cradle shone free and clear. The fear was broken. The tithe was gone. But the work of recovery, of learning to trust again, was just beginning. Rostova looked at the public inquiry channel, which now displayed the final judgment. The precedent was locked in. The Cathar's most powerful legal weapon was shattered, its use now outlawed in any system that adhered to the Galactic Codex. The entry blinked with a simple, stark finality. The mirror arrays on the Aurora court. Their quantum emitters, stressed and failing, finally dimmed to a cool, dormant gray. They thought their law was a collar, a tool to bind and control. We showed them it was a mirror and forced them to look at their own reflection. We did not come to destroy them, but to teach them. Justice is not about retribution. It is about balancing the ledger. For every debt, there must be a payment. For every lie, there must be a truth. And for every collar, there must be a reckoning. The universe does not forget. It merely waits for the accounting.